Hello and welcome to the big interview. I'm Anjana Menon and my guest today is Jairam Ramesh, India's Minister of Environment. Mr. Ramesh, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start with Cancun and the controversy surrounding it. And I'm quoting you in your letter to your MPs. You've said that you've called for a commitment in an appropriate legal form and not legally binding commitment. To start with, what's the difference between the two, and how is it that most world leaders read your stance as a dilution of India's stance and agreeing to legally binding cuts?
I don't think most world leaders read it as a dilution of India's stance. That's not true. I did say that all countries must take legally binding commitments in an appropriate legal form, and that remains my position. I don't have to feel defensive about it. I have written a letter to MPs, and I am hoping that in the budget session, if Parliament is allowed to function, we will have a full-fledged debate on this issue. I faced Parliament. We don't know what the legally binding agreement is all about. We don't know what the the form it's going to take, what the contents are, what its structure is going to be like. We don't know what the penalties for non-compliance are going to be. We don't know the system of monitoring. So it's premature to judge the ultimate outcome, right? Right now we are having a Kyoto Protocol. We have to understand certain global realities. Almost the entire developing world, the G77, wants a legally binding agreement. Within the basic quartet, South Africa and Brazil want a legally binding agreement in that language. Within SAARC, Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal and Bhutan want a legally binding agreement. The United States, China and India were the ones who were categorically saying no to a legally binding agreement, quote unquote. Many of the AOCIS, the small island states, in the Caribbean, in the Solomon Islands, in the Pacific, are all for a legally binding agreement. Now, what is India's negotiating position? India's negotiating position is to be sensitive, to be seen to be sensitive to the voices coming from our own G77, from our own colleagues in the developing world. So I have not diluted our commitment on a legally binding agreement. I have not said that we should have a legally binding agreement. And I have never said, contrary to what some Indian newspapers quoted, perhaps influenced by what some NGOs were saying, I have never said that we will take on absolute emission cuts. We have said, as part of the Copenhagen Accord, a relative emission cut. Emissions intensity per unit of GDP. In other words, for 1 unit of GDP you will require less emissions, and from 1 unit of emissions you will produce more GDP. So all I have said is that the developed world will take on absolute emission cuts. We will take on the relative emission cuts, emissions intensity per GDP, but we should be held domestically accountable and internationally accountable as well.
No, you say the US stance and China's stance, they've both rejected outright any binding legal agreements.
No.
The two big power brokers in the system.
They have not rejected outright.
If you're not aligned with the two big power brokers in the system.
By the way, India should, there's only one alignment possible for India, and that is alignment with itself. India must always seek to expand its negotiating space in order to protect and enhance its own national interest. As I mentioned to you, within the basic group, there are differences.
Indians seem to believe, we believe as a nation that we have the stature. But when it comes to the table, if China and the US are sitting on the other side and are saying no,
we have
realistically,
by the way, let me tell you,
how much of a chance do we stand?
No, by the way, on the transparency and accountability issue, it's now an open secret. Everybody knows it. Everybody acknowledged it. Chancellor Merkel herself has acknowledged it in front of our Prime Minister, that it was India that brought the United States and China together. This was the big sticking point at Cancun. To what extent that the Americans and the Chinese can come together on transparency. And it was India's proposal that was finally found acceptable. Not in its entirety, but a large portion of the proposal that India had made. So I think the important thing to do is to recognize that our position on climate change negotiations, I have always said, there have been 3 objectives. First, we protect India's economic interests. The ability to grow at 9 to 10% per year must not be jeopardized. Second, we advance our domestic environmental agenda. And third, we reposition India diplomatically. We change the narrative on India to put India in a pivotal position in order to be able to influence the future course of negotiations.